Well, good evening and welcome, everybody. I'm Terry Kay of the Jewish Grandparents Network. And tonight we have another experience in the Family Room Live series. Tonight we're so pleased to welcome Disabilities Inclusion Specialist Lisa Friedman and a real-life parent, Marcy Taylor. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know that the Family Room is now available for you to use. The Family Room is an online space for grandparents to find experiences, activities, and resources that can enrich your relationship with your grandchildren and infuse it with Jewish culture, traditions, and values. I'm going to take 1 minute just to show you very briefly what the Family Room is. You can see the illustration, and in the illustration, you can link to a variety of areas. There are actually 9 destinations. We've got gardening in the earth, play, health and well-being, family stories, the arts, and so on. And I will quickly show you 1 or 2 posts from the arts. I want to just emphasize that these experiences are asynchronous, meaning you do them in your own time and you choose what interests you and you do them with your grandchildren as it suits you. So 2 examples are you can learn how to take photos with your grandchildren and use those photos to tell a story. And my last, second and final example is we have some videos on how you can dance with your grandchildren, very short little choreographed experiences. I will put during the course of our time together, I will put the link to the Family Room into chat. 2 quick notes, and then I'm going to introduce our presenters tonight. 1, if you have a question, please put it in the chat box. We're going to keep this informal. We're going to ask your questions throughout. 2 is we recommend that you put your view in the top right corner to speaker rather than gallery, because that will allow a much more up close and personal experience with the speaker. Tonight, we are so pleased to welcome Lisa Friedman and Marcy Taylor. Lisa is a widely recognized expert in Jewish disability inclusion and has been a consultant to congregations, schools, and camps and other organizations for over 15 years. Lisa guides communities in the development of inclusive practices for faculty, clergy, leadership, and families through dialogue, interactive workshops, and awareness training. Lisa also currently serves as Director of Education at Temple Beth El in Hillsborough, New Jersey. And welcome to our other Temple Beth El friends tonight. Marcy Taylor is an active member of Beth El in Hillsborough, where she and her husband raised 2 children, one of whom has learning disabilities and health challenges. And Marcy is very pleased to share their story with us tonight. Handing it over to you, Lisa.
Terry, thank you so much. David, Terry, thank you. It's just such a pleasure. I'm so excited for this new venture of yours. I'm so excited to see all that the Jewish Grandparents Network is going to become. And it is really a pleasure to be here with all of you. Some familiar, friendly faces. So hi to all of you I've already met and to those I'm yet to meet. I'm so excited that we're going to have this opportunity to get to know each other a little bit this evening. Just to give you a sense of what we're going to do, I'm going to share some connection to Judaism and share some basic thoughts about inclusive language at the beginning. And then I'm going to turn it over to Marcy, who's going to share her story about her experience. We'll leave some space for questions in there, and then I'll return to speak a little bit about some tachlis, some how-to, some real practical tips that that you can really use in your family dynamics and with your grandchildren. And so, with that, I'm going to get us started by really framing us in Jewish values, and I think that the value that most defines what we are up to when we talk about what it means to be inclusive is the concept of B'Tselem Elohim, that each one of us is created in God's image. And it's really this stunning opportunity to go through the world to think about what it means that each person we encounter, each person we interact with in the world has the spark of God within them. And that not only is it our great opportunity to notice it and appreciate it, but also to help each person to bring that spark forward into the world. And I really think that that is one of those cornerstones of who we are as Jews, who we are as people, that when we look at one another and recognize in one another the stunning opportunity to elevate our relationships and elevate our experiences with one another, it brings us to a place where we can be open to those conversations that might get trickier or might get more complicated or might be harder. So with that, I'm going to shift us a little bit into the language of inclusion. And I really like to start a conversation like this by talking about the definition of inclusion. What's interesting is that there are different definitions depending on the community that you're in or the way in which you want to use the word. So let me share a little bit about what I mean. Inclusion, the word itself, the idea is that it is one is being included, one is part of a whole. And our families, our communities, our world is actually not complete if each person isn't part of that whole. And so to think about inclusion through the lens of belonging, that each one of us belongs to our families, to our communities, to this world that is ours to care for and shepherd, is really really instrumental in understanding inclusion. That said, inclusion is also a word that is used to refer to structures and to classrooms and to programs. And that's not the conversation we are all going to have together tonight. But I say that because those programs and those opportunities really do make it possible for people of all ages and at all different stages and abilities to get the support and the structures that they need to find their way into being successful. But when we talk about inclusion, what we're really talking about is a mindset, is not a classroom, not an organization, not a program, but that inclusion is a way of thinking, a way of welcoming one another, a way of interacting with each other, and a way of ensuring that each of us really truly feels as if we belong. And this isn't always an easy thing to do. It requires a lot of hard work. Things are different now than they were 2 years ago. Thank you, COVID. I feel like I can't have a conversation where I don't at least acknowledge the world that we're currently in. But even 5 years ago, and certainly 10 and 15 years ago, the world looks different than it did. And words that some of us may have grown up using or have become comfortable for us that we've used all of our lives may not be the best words or the best choice of the way to speak with other people anymore. And so I'm going to give you a really great example, not from disability, but from a personal example from gender, because we also know, just as some of the disability language has been changing and shifting, so too has gender language been shifting over the past few years. And so my children, I have an almost 19-year-old and I have a 21-year-old. And my children comfortably and naturally refer to individuals with they, them pronouns. It's normative for them. It's comfortable for them. They refer to Lex as them. I remember Lex when Lex was much younger, and that's harder for me. It takes me more work. I have to be conscious in thinking about the language that I choose and make sure that I choose the language that is most appropriate. And so too is it with disability language. Some things that once were okay, or even the right thing to say, aren't as comfortable for people as they may have been at that point in time. And so this trend, one of the most significant trends when we think about disability language is a notion of person first language, is putting a person before their disability, is referring to an individual as the person that they are and not leading with some feature that may not be all of who they are, right? So where it might have at one time been comfortable or been the norm for someone to be referred to as a blind person, person first language teaches us to refer to someone as a person who is blind. There's also identity first language. And this is an opportunity for individuals with disabilities to really shape their own experience. And many people, particularly in the autism and in the deaf communities, many people choose to lead with their disability because that's an identifying feature that they want to be upfront and be at the forefront of how they're spoken about. And so all of this is to say that the best way to figure it out is to ask, is to engage in a conversation, just like we would ask, how do you want me to introduce you? Or do you have a nickname that you'd like me to use? Or what are your pronouns? So too, can we now be asking, and should we be asking about disability language and what's comfortable for a person, both in the way that we refer to them and in the way that we refer about them, because there's nothing less comfortable, there's nothing more upsetting than when we make that mistake, or when we inadvertently feel as if we've made the mistake because we've tripped over our words. And so the rule of thumb is really this opportunity to ask and really understand what language each individual wants to choose and wants to use. So Terry, I would love to share, I know I promised you I would not create a PowerPoint at large, but I have one slide that I think is super helpful. Do I have screen share ability?
You do. And when you come to perhaps after you've shown the slide, Lisa, one of our participants, Doug, would like to ask you, who has a comment. So perhaps you might pause then so he can unmute himself and ask.
Great, fantastic, excellent. Let me put this up on the screen. Let me get this into the right mode so y'all can see it front and center. And so I would love to point out a couple of things about this slide, and then I would love to hear that comment. So let's see if I can make this. Is that full screen for everybody now? Yeah,
yes.
So great, Terry, terrific. So this is just a slide just to give a visual example of what I was referring to in terms of this notion of person first language, and just the beginning way to be thinking about some of the language that we may have once used or may have once thought was the right language, and it probably was at some point in time, and the evolution of who we are and where we are has brought us to a place where we're thinking differently about the way that we say things. And so this has a clear pattern of things that we can say instead of some of the phrases we have most commonly used. I think the most significant one here is about suffering. We have heard this phrase for years, is someone suffers from fill in the disability. And I think that that's not only potentially offensive for some people, because many people don't feel like they suffer from, but that they live with, and that they experience, and their experience is what their experience is, but that it's not less than. And so I think that's one of the most profound ones. Terry, let's pause and take that comment.
Okay, would you like to stop sharing your screen?
Love to.
That's very helpful. It's a very helpful slide. Doug, we invite you to unmute yourself?
Sure. So just as important as inclusivity is, I think it's very important and downright inappropriate, horrendous, and dare I say, evil-spirited to force someone into some kind of category or lifestyle or opinion they have never had and do not want to have and do not want to be considered part of. You know, it's very, yeah, it's very, like, everyone should be included. We should not exclude anybody. We should accept people for their differences. But if they don't want that category, that should not be forced upon them.
I think that's a great point. And what a really, I think actually, Marcy, a significant and perfect segue into some of what you've experienced, right, with your daughter, because there was some of that. There was some boxes. I won't tell your story. You get to tell your story. But I think that that's a really great point, Doug, is that there are times when, again, if we think of inclusion through the lens of structures, of programs, of organizations, sometimes we hope or we want individuals to fit into certain categories or fit into certain boxes so that they can be. And you're absolutely right. I think it's all about personal choice and what's comfortable and enjoying and opening wide and saying, come in, and letting people choose where and when and how. So Marcy, I'm going to turn it over to you. Was that, Tyree, was there another one, or was that it for the moment?
That's it for the moment.
Amazing. So I'm going to turn it over to you for a little bit, Marcy.
Hi, thank you for having me tonight. Thrilled to be here. Before I get going, I'm going to beg your indulgence because my little talk is on this paper. I'm not a teacher, and I don't speak normally to groups on Zoom, so I'm not really quite used to not using this paper crutch. So when you see my eyes going to the side, it's not that I'm not interested in seeing your eyes, but this is where all the information is. So I'm just going to go forward. I'm going to give you a little background about my daughter, my family, and then I'm going to just kind of segue into my thoughts about family, let's call it family positioning, and other kids in the family, and how everything hangs together, and how what I think a grandparent relationship really means to a child in this situation. So here we go. And if you have any questions, just raise your hand or stop me, or no problem. From an early age, my daughter presented differently than other children. She walked slower. She didn't sit up as quick. Her milestones were very delayed by months, and sometimes even years in certain situations. The doctors told us she was behind what was normal for children her age. We talked about the concept of normal just a few minutes ago. So, but this is the wording that they used to us 20 odd years ago. And we could tell ourselves that there was differences because we had an older child. And even though you try not to, as a parent, and all of you are grandparents, so you were all parents, you know that if you have multiple children, you are looking at all of them and seeing what each one is doing, and it's in the back of your mind. Her growth was slower, and that includes her physical growth. She was always a little peanut. She's still a little peanut, even as a grown-up. But mostly her educational and emotional growth was somewhat slower than the average child. After a few years of being discouraged in the school system, we finally were able to get her tested by the team in school. And what we heard from them was, I guess, not unexpected. She had physical delays, she had emotional delays, she had academic delays. So over the next several years, we tried to work within the public school system to get additional resources to help her. She needed help in reading and writing and math, and she needed help on the monkey bars because she didn't have the strength or the coordination that other children had. We also worked with her tirelessly at home. We had physical therapists, occupational therapists, and more tutors than I could count or pay at our house on a revolving basis. As hard as we tried, by the time the end of 6th grade rolled around, we really felt that she wasn't being served in the public school and that she would benefit from going to schools that taught exclusively children with learning differences. At that point, she went through numerous tests again and was diagnosed as dyslexic, and also had an auditory processing disorder and ADD. Now, it was a type of ADD that's hard to put your finger on because she did not have the H part of ADD or ADHD, the hyperactivity part. Hers was strictly that she couldn't focus for extended periods of time. So after years of dealing with these undiagnosed conditions, our young sweet girl developed severe symptoms of anxiety and depression, which is also very common in children with learning disabilities or learning differences. And it was scary for her, we think. She could not function on the same level as her peers, and it became harder and harder for her. So this anxiety and developed and was just another layer on top of everything else that we continued to deal with throughout the years. Over this time, she attended 3 different private schools, each of which helped her in a different way, up to and including her senior year of high school, which she spent at a boarding school, which focused on skills, academic skills, but also social skills and how to live in the world. After high school, she decided that she was done with school for a while. She just needed a real break because it was hard. Learning was hard for her. So she participated in a gap year program. It was a Jewish gap year program in Portland, Oregon. And at this program, she lived in a house with other Jewish high school graduates, and they did a series of volunteer internships in the community. And it was a really great experience for her. And as I wrote here, it fostered the notion that regardless of her challenges, she could be successful. This was really the first time that she really felt that she might be able to succeed out in the world. Just as an aside, one of the few very bright spot moments during her teen years was her ability to make her bat mitzvah on time. She did make her bat mitzvah when she was 13 years old. It was truly amazing to us that a person with such severe dyslexia could do this. But our temple had a fantastic alternative program, and it made a big difference to her, her learning. This personal attention made a great difference to her learning and her ability to read and chant. To this day, we still haven't figured out why it's easier for her to read Hebrew than it is to read English, but I'm sure there's a linguist somewhere or a specialist somewhere that could give us that answer. But even to this day, she would say that Hebrew was way easier to read than English. But as I said, if we could get her biology textbooks in Hebrew, we'd be in really good shape, I think. She's a sophomore in college now, Amanda, and she's doing extraordinarily well. She works about, I would say, 3 times harder than every other kid doing the same work. but she excels in her coursework, and she uses little or no additional outside help. She pretty much does everything on her own. She's searched out ways to use technology, which is now readily available for people especially with dyslexia. There's a lot of online materials and programs that help them. She is an absolutely fantastic writer. She has a future ahead of her, she thinks, in writing legislation in the area of criminal justice, which is really quite extraordinary. And through her own hard work, she's been able to get control over her anxiety and live a relatively, quote, normal life, which is really a miracle to us. So now you know a little bit about my family background, a little bit about what we've gone through. And I will tell you that what I just told you is about 10% of what there really is. When you have a child with learning disabilities and challenges, there's a lot going on. But when I was thinking about tonight's program, my thoughts went more toward the entire family, not just the child with the learning disabilities, but all the children in the family. And we know how important it is that each grandchild feels that they're a valued and respected member of the family. So while we've spoken a great deal about the children with the disabilities, I think it's key that we're all mindful of those other children, the ones that don't necessarily get all of mom and dad's attention all the time. Sometimes I think if we don't spend a little extra time with those children, they start to feel left behind in their own way. Mom and dad struggle. I'm sorry, I'm in a classroom. Mom and dad struggle with, on a day-to-day basis, just trying to get through the day sometimes with the child that has learning disabilities. And sometimes, even though we don't realize it, the other children might feel somewhat left behind. So what I can say to you today is, if you're fortunate enough to be able to see your grandchildren, either physically or online on Zoom, I encourage you to spend as much time as you can with them as well. These kids will be ever grateful to you for reading a book with them, or watching a TV program, or taking a walk with them and just talking about their life. I think grandparents can show how proud they are of their everyday successes, even at times when mom and dad might forget to do that. I think it's really, for grandparents, you have accumulated so much wisdom through bringing up your children, and now with your grandchildren. Share it with them, teach them things, be their friend. And the parents will really be thankful to you for that. They have a lot of stress on them, and this is something that you can really, really help with. So I won't go on too long, but that's just kind of what I was thinking when I put this all together. I hope I gave you a little insight into what it's like to be a parent of a child with learning disability. And I'll be glad to take any questions you have, or you can throw eggs at me, or whatever you want to do.
Thank you. Thank you, Marcy. Thank you. While you were presenting, there was quite a bit of chatter, and we have several that you can take a look at, because we're going to hand it back to Lisa now.
Absolutely. And I think that, so first of all, Marcy, thank you. I've had the good fortune of knowing Marcy's family and knowing Marcy's children, both of them, since they were in grade school, and can speak firsthand to how stunning they are and how unique and special they are separately from one another. And so I think that that's a really significant piece. And I want to just also lift up what Marcy just said, this notion of that individual time, that the greatest gift you might be able to offer to your family is spending time with the child who maybe feels like they're getting less attention because the medical needs, the physical needs, the learning needs are taking up the parents' attention in different ways. And I think there's also another great comment in the chat box that there is such distinct variety and variation amongst the differences, right? Children with physical differences and disabilities have much different needs than children with learning disabilities, than children who have cognitive disabilities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then of course, those who have a combination of many. And so, you know, it all leads us back to this: every child is unique, every child is special, every child has, you know, what is stunning about them. And I think that that's really, as we shift now, I'm going to move us a little bit into some thoughts on some practical tips, some ways that you as grandparents and as members of families can sort of not just be more inclusive, but can sort of lift up and be supportive of the family dynamic. David, is your hand raised?
David and Susan.
Please.
Is that okay? If you, David,
Of course, that's okay.
Yeah. That's actually not my hand. You know, I think
it's too yellow for you. Keep going. You're good.
one of the things that I know that Lee, our president of our board of directors, that's on the call, Lee Hendler, often says is that, you know, this is not the families we imagined we'd had 40 years ago, speaking about today's new Jewish families. And that's often the case when it comes to grandchildren who have learning or developmental differences and even gender differences than what a grandparent would expect. These are not the grandkids I thought I would have when I was going to have grandkids. And I always assumed I was going to be playing ball with my grandkid or being able to draw. And so I think, as I know there are clinicians and professionals on the call, I think part of what worth thinking about from a grandparent's perspective is, you know, what is it like for the grandparents? What's the feeling of loss? What's the feeling? What are the emotions that they're struggling with, that they may be dealing with? There may be issues related to their own childhood or their own raising or whatever. But I think it's important to talk about what grandparents can do, but it's also important for us professionals to recognize or to realize what grandparents are experiencing.
Absolutely. No, that's such a great point. One of the first things I bring into dialogue when I do family dialogue, or I have those kinds of conversations, is exactly what you bring up, David, is this idea that of grief, right? That it doesn't mean that who we are is not amazing, but we grieve what we thought would be, right? In any kind of situation. And in this case, we're talking specifically about disabilities. And it's not that we're grieving for an individual specifically, but we're grieving for what might have been or what could have been, and learning how to encounter what can now be. There's a great piece. If you're not familiar with it, it has stood the test of time. It has been out there forever and ever and ever, and it holds up. Howard's smiling. He knows what I'm going to say. I have a feeling. There's a great piece called Welcome to Holland. Thank you, all the people that are nodding. If you have not heard of this, we're going to make sure we get the link. We're going to toss it into the chat for you. It is a short essay. It is called Welcome to Holland. It puts front and center this notion of thinking differently, right? Not bad, not broken, not the end of, but rather what can now be? What can we celebrate? How can we move forward? So I would highly suggest.
Is it a one-page?
It's a
PDF
one-page
by Emily Poole Kingsley.
What's the name?
the author is Emily Pearl Kingsley.
Yep.
Welcome to it. Okay, I'm going to put that in chat. I
Perfect.
want to just quickly introduce David Raphael, and I was neglectful in not doing so. David is the co-founder with Lee Hendler of the Jewish Grandparents Network, and he's also the CEO of the organization.
Susan, that's why I called on David first, but Susan, just so you know, I knew that already.
Well, thank you. It's so interesting. I'm here because Lisa and I worked together many years. I hadn't seen her in such a long time, and Terry, it's really wonderful to see you as well. What struck me as I was listening to Marcy was the role of grandparent. I am very fortunate that my daughter lives in town, daughter, son-in-law, 2 grandkids. And my husband and I have had a major role with the grandkids since they were born, a little bit less during COVID, but now back to a lot of time with them. And while both children at this point are typical, they're doing really well. My granddaughter is now in kindergarten, and she was the kindergarten teacher noticed that she was having difficulty with certain speech elements, sounds, and so she was given this opportunity to work with a speech therapist on a weekly basis in school, but has homework and practice to do. And what I was finding was, because I pick her up 3 days a week, I am now the one who does the practice and the homework, and I check in with her because her father and mother both work full-time, crazy schedules, and sometimes they just don't have I wish they could focus fully on their kids when they get home, but it's preparing dinner and it's getting the bath and everything. So I've had this opportunity to really make this added learning fun. And I see that as a grandparent, I have time. I'm not stressed by the other things, and I can fully devote that time to the grandchildren and giving them that extra curricular help. So that's really where I was going. Again, I think back to when I was a working parent, and I realized, and my son and daughter and I talk about this a lot now, and they are in their 30s. I was a single working parent, and my mother really spent a lot of time with them and really helped them through a lot of the things that I just wasn't able to do. And while fortunately they did not have learning disabilities at the time, they still needed attention that I wasn't able to give. So I think if I look at the bigger picture, it's that as a grandparent, I can really offer full attention to these grandkids. And speaking of grandkids, I'm getting off for a minute because I'm getting a FaceTime call. So I'll be back.
Amazing. I think that that's such a great thing to celebrate, this idea of time, right? That as you move into the role of grandparent, that you may be blessed with more time than you may have had 5, 6, 10 years ago. And how can you use that time in a meaningful way, and in a meaningful way in relationship with your grandchildren, especially those who may have some kind of disability or challenge or need that kind of extra support. Nareed, I see your hand. I'm going to share 2 practical tips, and then I'm going to jump over to you. Does that work? Great. Mostly because they just follow right in line with what Susan was just saying. So I just want to sort of stay in that space, and then we'll jump in another direction. One of the things that I was going to suggest, that I was going to say, is take every opportunity you can to learn everything that you can about, not just about your grandchildren, but about disabilities. And I think that flows so beautifully from this idea of time and, embracing that there's more time, not to be shy about asking for more information, but also taking the lead and learning yourself and finding out more information, not from the perspective of, now I know everything and I'm going to tell you what it all is, but from the perspective of empowering yourself, the more you know, the more comfortable you're going to be in forging and developing the kind of relationship that feels comfortable for you and for your family. You know, sometimes I do, I'm not going to even say we, maybe you do what I do. I have this lovely habit of liking to tell people all the things that I know, right? And sometimes that can be off-putting, right? I learn what I need to know, and then I share with my husband or my children all the things that I know. And maybe they had a different idea about what they thought or what they wanted. And so, you know, there's that fine line, there's that balance between sharing and information sharing and oversharing and, you know, imposing one's thoughts and ideas. But I share with you this idea that the more you know, the more empowered you will feel to engage in the conversations and ask questions. And the more, and that's sort of the second thing, is to ask questions. Ask more about what you don't know. Ask about language. Ask about the children themselves. Ask what's going on so that you can be more helpful. Ask about your children and what you can do to be supportive of them and what they most need. The more questions that you can ask, the more powerful your relationships are going to be with your grandchildren and with your children. So Nurit, I see that you also have your hand up.
Actually, Lisa, you just covered some of what I was going to say. As much as we may not have the grandchildren we had envisioned, our children often, especially when they have a child who's born with a severe disability or an intellectual disability, are reeling when they have to deal with the situation. So as grandparents or parents in that sense to our adult children, it's important for us to step up and be supportive. I mean, everyone assumes that their grandchild is going to be perfect at birth, but that's everyone's expectation. And the reality is no one is perfect. So, you know, in many cases, there are things that are going to evolve slowly over time, but when you have a child with a significant physical, intellectual limitation, and that presents at birth, is really quite a shock for the whole family. So as grandparents, we should just be there, be supportive, listen, and do what we can to help our children.
I think that's such a great point. And I think that it's a beautiful role to find yourselves in, is to sort of figure out and find that space. And it's not easy, and it's going to evolve with time, right? And you're going to find that the space that you reside now may be different than the space you're going to need to reside in 5 years from now and in 10 years from now. And the conversations you may have now with your adult children when your grandchildren are small also evolve as your grandchildren age. Then you can be in conversation with them. Just because mom or dad suggested language, for example, we started this conversation about language use. Just because mom and dad suggested that the language that they'd like to use when referring to your grandchild, well, when your grandchild is of an age to speak for themselves, what a powerful opportunity to change and evolve and shift the conversation yet again, and to find out and to be their advocate and to help them to advocate for themselves. I think that as grandparents, and Marcy said, you know, your wealth of wisdom, I couldn't agree with that more, is you've been to this rodeo a few times. You've seen people, right, who have grown and gone through life stages. And so you do have that wisdom to be able to recognize when it's time for the conversation to evolve again. So I think that's terrific. Doug, I see that your hand is up again. Yes, that's new. It's not, is it from before or is it a new one?
Oh, it's new.
Okay, great.
So one of the things I was going to say before I got distracted by David chewing at me was that I find that physical activity, such as like in my life, like in high school, I wrestled. And then after my separation, I did a lot of mixed martial arts. And I find, you know, I don't have a disability, but I find that that kind of activity, at least for me, was extremely rewarding and made me of a mental mindset and a physical mindset at the time too, where I was ready to take on challenges much bigger than I could have anticipated. Much bigger than I could have anticipated. So it is how it is. I mean, I think those kinds of sports, and my point is, help even people in the disability community. So even when people have special needs, disabilities, whatever you want to call it, I almost don't like the term disabilities or special needs per se, because I feel like just because a person has something doesn't mean they can't compensate in ways to do amazing things with their life. So I've worked with people who were I've worked with a paraplegic attorney who went to Berkeley, and he was a paraplegic when he went to Berkeley, and he was smart. He knew the law. I worked with a legal secretary at the Social Security Administration who didn't have the use for legs, what was a Paralympian, and was in better shape than I was. She was kind of hot, but it's fine. It's fine. People can have all kinds of disabilities and they can do amazing things with them. And I don't think we should necessarily, I don't like the idea of using that to categorize them first. I mean, I do kind of see what you're saying with autism, but because they want people to know ahead of time what their limitations are, because it can be an issue. But in most circumstances, I think lots of people have lots of different kinds of things, and finding ways around them is what's important. And I think sports is a great way to do that.
I think that's great. I think that's terrific. Lori, I'm going to make 2 other comments and then I'm going to ask you to unmute. Is that good? Does that work for you? Great. So one of the other things we sort of went in this direction, but I wanted to say it even more overtly, is this idea of speaking to children and not about children. I think that hits a little bit on a number of the different comments and some of what Doug was just saying, and some of what some of the other people have also been saying this evening, is remembering that, again, back to B'Tselem Elohim, back to this notion that each of us has the spark of God within us, and that each of us is a person that wants to be loved and wants to fulfill our life's promise, whatever that looks like, whatever that's going to be. And I think whenever it is possible for you to speak directly to your grandchildren or speak directly to children rather than about children, especially or in particular, if when there is an individual who may be less verbal or nonverbal, right? That sometimes it's a tendency to talk about them or talk to them through the person who's supporting them. And I just want to encourage all of us to be thinking about ways that we can be speaking directly to and interacting directly with individuals. And the other piece is that I think that being vulnerable yourself, again, back to the wealth of life experience that you've had and the wisdom that you bring to the experience, but this idea that you can be vulnerable yourself, that you can share your challenges, share your disabilities, share your life's frustrations in open and real ways. I think that is also going to add to the depth of a relationship. That's not an oversharing statement. That's not me telling you, go ahead, tell your children and your grandchildren absolutely everything. But I think there are really appropriate and meaningful ways that you can lift a dialogue and enhance a relationship by sharing some of those challenges that you've encountered over the years and how you've either worked through them or how you still struggle with them, as a way of being vulnerable and a way of saying that I know that X could be hard for you, right? Susan shared speech challenges, right? Maybe you also had a similar challenge when you were younger. And so I would encourage anytime that you are able to be vulnerable and share your own experiences, that enriches the relationship. Lori, please.
Thank you for this whole workshop, seminar, Zoom, whatever we want to call it. I really appreciate it. I am the new coordinator, the first and only coordinator for a grandparenting program that we're developing at the Metro Detroit Jewish Community Center through J Family. And as a grandparent myself, I have my own experiences, and I have a background in early childhood, and I've worked with different age groups through my career. But special needs, and I was told that's not always inclusive, and disabilities is too broad, and I understand that, but has always been just a little bit uncomfortable for me. And probably because I'm so sensitive to not wanting to insult someone or put them, use the wrong words. And at the same time, I think all the time, since language is evolving and there's new concepts that are acceptable and some things that have become very not acceptable and looked down on. I mean, from race to sexuality to now disabilities, everything. Sometimes being politically correct is like mind-boggling, very difficult. And I think about grandparents, not only my age, but are even older, it becomes really difficult. We've got bad habits. We didn't know they were bad habits because they were very acceptable X amount of years ago. So my feeling has always been trying to come across as genuinely as I can, even though I might not use exactly the right words. And I'm wondering if anyone on this call feels the same way or has a way around that, or some kind of advice that I can give grandparents who, I think of race things because of my grandparents and when they grew up. And, now we say, we don't use the word Black. We certainly don't use the word Negro. And, I can hear in my grandmother, we would always be correcting her. Grandma, that's not okay. But if the intent was positive, negative was a whole different thing than she really heard from us. So how do we present that positive, I'm here for you, I want to learn, I want to listen, but not necessarily recall the he, she, they part like you discussed, or the disabilities, the exact terminology that we should be using?
I've got an answer, and then I'd love to see if anybody else has one as well. I mean,
Lisa, excuse me, we have about 5 minutes left.
Great.
So if you
Great, I'll give a really quick answer, and then if anybody else has an answer or other questions, let's do it. But I think the disclaimer, it's back to that vulnerability statement that I just made. I think the disclaimer is huge. I think saying, I'm learning, help me learn, I'm learning, I might make a mistake, and then just have your dialogue, have your conversation, but preface it by saying, I'm still learning, I'm still growing, I hope you'll help me.
I tend to think political correctness kills the conversation, which is part of the problem, not the solution. Which is not to say language doesn't matter, it does. How you treat people matters more than anything else, but I think making people not able to use certain words or be totally thrown out of their jobs or things like that for saying certain things, I think it's gotten extreme to a point where we're actually damaging the dialogue and affecting our ability to communicate as a nation and as a group of people, and that's a problem. That's not a good thing.
Howard.
Lisa, I completely agree with what you just said, and you may have even been there when this happened. But a number of years ago, when they had these Ruderman conferences, there was a session on language, and I remember very clearly that a person, accidentally used the word retarded, and got shouted down. And the person basically never got the memo that the word changed. When I was in school, there was the Journal of Mental Retardation. I mean, that was a word that we all used. And the person said, you don't know me. In my business, I hired 20 people with disabilities. I just didn't get, so it was really about, he said, educate me, teach me. I'm a good learner. I didn't know. And I think that you use the example of general language with kids. My kids are always correcting me about Black people of color, also you didn't get, things changed. So we're all, same thing in our camps. When it comes to gender issues, it's the people who are in their 50s and older who squirm because in discomfort, because we don't know, the words keep changing and can't keep up with it. So I think it's really just about saying, honestly, educate. I just don't know. I want to learn. And I think that the way you said it is so nice. It's really.
Thank you. It's good to see your face, my friend.
Lisa, any final thoughts?
I think that I'm so happy that you're here, and I'm so happy that you want to be a part of a dialogue and that you're thinking deeply about how you can be in relationship with your children, with your grandchildren, and with those who have disabilities, and the intersection of all of it. And I think, final thoughts are, don't stop here. Keep having these conversations. Think about what you learned here, dive deeper, ask more questions, and ask more questions.
Fantastic, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much. I so appreciate your being here, Lisa and Marcy, and especially grateful to our participants tonight. This is the most engaged, amazing group, and thank you for sharing and your personal thoughts. It's enormously enlightening for many of us. We are recording the session. We will post it in our Facebook group. Here again is the link to join our Facebook group. It's in the chat. And we welcome you. It's a loving and supportive community of 12 or 1300 grandparents. We would welcome your voice in the group. We will also let you know there that we have another, I think, amazing session coming up, presented by Dr. Chris Willard, who is a Harvard professor and an expert and a consultant in spirituality in children. He'll be presenting on resilience, how we can build resilience in our grandchildren. That will be on January the 11th. Meanwhile, with our profound thanks to you, Lisa, and to Marcy.
I think Howard has a question there. He's got his hand raised. Howard, don't you have a question?
Unmute, Howard.
I didn't put my hand back down. Sorry, I spoke already. Thank you for reminding me.
Oh, you're welcome, ma'am.
To all of you, have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to be sending you a follow-up email as soon as we get off with a couple of links in it, including a link to a very short survey, because we would love to get your feedback about how helpful the session was to you. So again, with our many, many thanks, we are going to declare our evening over.
Thank you so much.